more than 2 centuries. A work of art is first and foremost a work of expression. And as a product of expression, it requires the artist to be articulate in whatever form the medium requires: paint, song, line. And L'Enfant provides us an especially interesting conundrum as we seek to understand the meanings of his plan, because he was at the same time enormously articulate and inarticulate. In the language of drawn line, as a sketch artist, an engineering illustrator, architect, city planner, he had few, if any, equals in the United States of the Revolutionary and Federalist era. It was not a country full of people who were doing a lot of drawing. It was a country where it was full of a lot of work, a lot of talking, a lot of other things, but art was not something that the United States took as its first priority in the last decades of the 18th century. He had few equals. He had been trained at the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. As far as I know, at least when he was working on the city of D.C., that made him unique in the United States. But in the language of words, especially the English language, L'Enfant faced an enormous challenge. And it's one he often failed to meet. I've spent hours, and not hours is the wrong word, hours and hours and days and weeks at the Library of Congress with his letters and his manuscripts, and transcribing them is a daunting task, to say the best. Yet this handicap with language didn't prevent him from producing tens of thousands of written words about his work on the federal city before, during, and after the project. The interesting thing for a physical place, a three-dimensional place that's based on a two-dimensional drawing, writing was very important to the process of the creation of Washington, D.C. And part of that reason for that is because the person overseeing the creation of Washington, D.C. was George Washington. L'Enfant's writings about the federal city were produced in 3 forms: a fairly small collection of letters to various involved and interested parties, including Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Washington, many other people. A series of longer memorandums, that they called them, and those were written at Washington's behest. Washington liked to work this way, as many of you, I'm sure, know. When he had a dilemma, a problem to solve, an issue to think over, he would have the relevant advisors write him long memorandums. He would not bring them into a room and have them speak to him, at least not yet. He would like to receive their thoughts in writing. This is how the plan for manufacturers was considered. This is how the National Bank was considered. And this is how Washington, D.C. was considered. L'Enfant was asked to produce these memorials and then present this piece of writing that went along with these plans. I don't think it was L'Enfant's first preference. L'Enfant much would have preferred to sit in front of George Washington and explain what George Washington was looking at. But he took to the task of writing these with a verve, if not with skill in English. And they provide an enormously important record. The third form of writing, that I find in many ways most interesting, was a set of what L'Enfant called memorials. After he had been removed or quit the project, after he had fallen into financial distress, after he had come under the care of the Diggs family, he would write these memorials to Congress, and what he was asking for was back pay and recognition for the work he had done on the federal city, because he asked for and accepted no pay during the project, and certainly received no recognition after he left. And he wrote these memorials sometimes several a year. Sometimes they went dozens and dozens of pages, and they're all either in the Library of Congress or in the National Archives. And fascinating reading. Many of them are, especially the later ones, were fractured, rambling. Some of them were even incoherent. A psychologist or a psychiatrist would have an interesting time looking through them, looking for signs of perhaps depression, perhaps there's a fairly strong case that L'Enfant by that time in his life was addicted to opium. And yet these documents, he continued to write them and continued to make the same points with his scattershot approach to English grammar, vocabulary, and punctuation. And his struggle with his language is what makes it all the more remarkable that for 30 years his message stayed precisely on point, expressing a set of rationales, conceptual underpinnings, and arguments so consistently and convincingly that the reader, or at least this reader, is left with little doubt about what did and didn't make up his original vision of the federal city. 3 times in the period spanning March of 1791 and February of 1792, L'Enfant spoke in person with George Washington about his work on the plan, each time bearing that lengthy memorandum. Their first conversation was almost certainly at Sutter's Inn in Georgetown in March of 1791, less than 3 weeks after L'Enfant had arrived on site. The text of his first accompanying memorandum contains a small but vital set of first decisions that predated any designs on paper. That's a couple months before he created this plan. At that point, L'Enfant wrote of the European Baroque tradition of city planning, although he didn't name it that. But implicitly and consistently, he outlined, quote, a sense of the real grand and truly beautiful, and at that moment, the first moment, declared himself the enemy of, quote, the tiresome and insipid grid plan exemplified in his mind by Philadelphia. He had no desire. It's very, very interesting to realize that L'Enfant is still, what would it be, 15 years, 14 years away from his death when the country's most prominent example of the grid plan is put in place with the 1811 Commissioner's Plan for New York City that dictated all the long blocks in New York City heading all the way up the island of Manhattan. That was